I stood at the podium of the Grand Ballroom at Riverside Country Club, looking out at 300 faces that represented everything I'd built from nothing. The chandeliers cast golden light across tables filled with successful women entrepreneurs, business leaders, and the kind of people who'd never known what it felt like to be invisible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My company, Hayes & Associates, was celebrating its 5th anniversary and our biggest year yet. But in the back corner at a table I'd specifically reserved, sat 4 people who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on earth. My parents, Thomas and Linda Hayes, my brother Brandon, and my Aunt Carol. They were here because I'd invited them, not out of love, but because sometimes the sweetest victory is served on fine china to people who once made you eat off paper plates. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were now the ones picking at the expensive catered meal while I held the microphone, addressing a room full of people who actually respected what I had to say. 20 years ago, I would have done anything for their approval. Tonight, I didn't need it. I had something better. I had proof. Growing up as Amanda Hayes in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, meant learning early that love came with conditions, and those conditions were rarely in my favor. Our family lived in a sprawling colonial house in Maple Grove, the kind of neighborhood where success was measured by the size of your driveway and the cost of your Christmas decorations. From the outside, we looked like the American dream. My father Thomas ran Hayes Development, a real estate company that had been turning farmland into shopping centers for 15 years. My mother Linda hosted book clubs and charity luncheons, always perfectly dressed and perpetually concerned with appearances. My older brother Brandon was the golden child who could do no wrong, even when he was doing everything wrong. And then, there was me. The afterthought. The daughter who was useful when they needed someone to clean up messes but invisible when they were handing out opportunities. I learned the hierarchy early. Every family dinner was a lesson in my place. Brandon got the biggest portion of everything. The prime rib, the first scoop of mashed potatoes, the corner piece of cake with the most frosting. I got what was left. When Brandon wanted seconds, I was told to finish what was on my plate first, even if it was just scraps. When new clothes were bought, Brandon got the expensive brands while I got the clearance items or hand-me-downs from our cousin Melissa, who was 2 sizes bigger than me. The clothes never fit right, but I was told to be grateful that someone thought of me at all. The physical scraps were just the beginning. The real hunger was for something else entirely. Recognition, respect, the simple acknowledgement that I existed as more than just a convenience. When I was 12, Brandon broke my mother's favorite vase while throwing a football in the house. I was the one who got yelled at for not putting it in a safer place. When I was 15, I won the state essay contest for young entrepreneurs, and the celebration dinner turned into a discussion about Brandon's latest lacrosse achievement. When I graduated valedictorian from high school, my father spent the entire graduation party talking to neighbors about Brandon's plans to join the family business after his mediocre performance at State University. I wasn't just overlooked. I was systematically trained to expect less and ask for nothing. The Hayes Development Office became my second home during high school summers. While Brandon was at expensive sports camps or vacation trips with friends, I was filing documents, answering phones, and learning the business from the ground up. My father never asked me to work there. It was simply expected. Brandon would inherit the company someday, but someone needed to handle the details in the meantime. That someone was always me. I became fluent in real estate law, zoning regulations, and construction timelines before I could legally vote. I reorganized their filing system, created digital backups of contracts that had been moldering in boxes for years, and caught several billing errors that saved the company thousands of dollars. My contributions were noted with the same enthusiasm, reserved for someone taking out the trash. It was just something that needed to be done. The summer before my senior year, I discovered that my parents had established college funds for both of their children. Brandon's fund had grown to nearly $60,000. Mine had $800. When I asked about the discrepancy, my mother explained that boys need more education opportunities, and besides, I was smart enough to earn scholarships. The assumption was that my brain was a resource to be exploited, not invested in. I did earn scholarships. Full academic rides to 3 different universities. I chose Iowa State, close enough to help with the business when needed, far enough away to breathe. I majored in business administration with a minor in psychology, graduating summa cum laude, while working 20 hours a week at a local marketing firm. Brandon, meanwhile, was failing half his classes at a school my parents were paying $40,000 a year for him to attend. When I came home for Christmas break my junior year, I found Brandon sleeping until noon every day and spending his evenings at bars, charging everything to a credit card linked to the company account. When I mentioned to my father that this might not be the best use of business funds, he told me that Brandon was under a lot of pressure and needed to unwind. When I asked what pressure he could possibly be under, given that he hadn't held a job or passed a challenging class in 3 years, my father's response was simple. He's preparing to take over the company. That takes mental energy. Mental energy. As if thinking about inheriting something required the same effort as actually building it. The real breaking point came during my senior year. I had been accepted to graduate school with a full assistantship to study business development. I had also been offered an entry-level position at a consulting firm in Chicago that specialized in helping small businesses scale. Both opportunities represented everything I had worked toward. Both would take me away from Cedar Rapids and the endless cycle of being useful but unimportant. When I told my parents about my options over Sunday dinner, the response was swift and dismissive. Linda looked up from her pot roast just long enough to say that Chicago was too far away and too dangerous for a young woman living alone. Thomas was more direct. The family business needed someone reliable to handle operations while Brandon learned the ropes. I had proven myself capable, and loyalty to family came first. Brandon, who had contributed nothing to this conversation or the family business, nodded seriously and said he thought I should stick around. "Someone needs to handle the boring stuff while I focus on the big picture," he said, as if he had ever seen a big picture that wasn't painted on the side of a sports bar. I realized in that moment that my value to them was not as a daughter or even as an employee. I was a resource, a free resource who could be counted on to handle whatever they didn't want to deal with, who would never complain because I had been trained from childhood to accept scraps and call them meals. That night, I called Rachel Kim, my roommate from sophomore year who had transferred to Northwestern to study law. Rachel had grown up in a family that celebrated her achievements instead of diminishing them, and she had watched my family dynamics during the few times she had visited Cedar Rapids. Her assessment was blunt. "They're using you, Amanda. They've been using you your entire life, and they're going to keep using you until you decide you're worth more than their leftovers." She was right. I had spent 21 years waiting for them to see my value, and all I had gotten in return was the opportunity to make their lives easier while they made mine smaller. I accepted the job in Chicago. The reaction was immediate and predictable. My mother cried and told me I was being selfish. My father accused me of abandoning the family right when they needed me most. Brandon, who had never shown interest in the day-to-day operations of anything, suddenly became concerned about who would handle all the important details he couldn't be bothered to learn. But the most telling response came from Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, who had always been the family truth-teller. She pulled me aside after the dinner where I had announced my decision and said something I had never expected to hear. "You know, Amanda, I always wondered when you were going to get tired of eating scraps. Your parents are good people, but they've never understood that fairness isn't about giving everyone the same thing. It's about giving everyone what they need to succeed. Brandon needed coddling, so that's what they gave him. You needed opportunities, but they gave you obligations instead." Carol was right. but her insight came 20 years too late. I had already learned to find my own opportunities. Moving to Chicago felt like learning to breathe in a place where the air wasn't rationed. My apartment was small, but it was mine. My job was challenging but rewarding, and for the first time in my life, my contributions were acknowledged and celebrated. I was promoted twice in my first year, not because of who my family was, but because of what I could accomplish. I called home every Sunday for the first few months, mostly out of habit. The conversations followed the same pattern. My mother would update me on neighborhood gossip and remind me how much I was missed. My father would give me brief updates on the business and hint that there was always a place for me if I wanted to come back. Brandon rarely came to the phone, and when he did, our conversations lasted less than 5 minutes. He was busy learning the business, which seemed to involve a lot of golf meetings and networking lunches. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By my second year in Chicago, the Sunday calls became bi-weekly, then monthly. I was building a life that didn't revolve around their needs, and the distance was necessary for me to understand how much space their expectations had taken up in my head. I met David Porter during my third year in Chicago. He was a business consultant in his 60s who had built and sold 2 successful companies. He became my mentor, not because I needed someone to take care of me, but because he recognized ambition when he saw it and wanted to help it grow. David was the first person who ever asked me what I wanted to build, instead of what I was willing to support. Under his guidance, I started freelancing as a business consultant on weekends, helping small companies with strategic planning and operations management. The work was similar to what I had been doing for my family's business, but with one crucial difference. I was being paid for my expertise instead of expected to provide it for free. My client base grew quickly. Word spread that I could help struggling businesses identify inefficiencies and implement systems that actually worked. Within 2 years, I was making more from my weekend consulting than from my full-time job. David suggested it was time to make the leap. Hayes & Associates was officially launched on a Tuesday morning in October. I chose to keep the family name not out of sentimentality, but out of a quiet sense of justice. They had made me carry their name while treating me like I was barely part of the family. Now I would make that name mean something they had never managed to achieve. The business grew faster than I had anticipated. My first year, I had 12 clients and revenue of $87,000. My second year, I had 31 clients and revenue of $215,000. By my third year, I had hired 2 employees and was turning away potential clients because we were booked solid. I called home to share the news of my success, expecting at least some acknowledgement of what I had accomplished. The reaction was tepid at best. My mother congratulated me, but quickly changed the subject to Brandon's engagement to his college girlfriend. My father asked a few questions about my business model, then spent the rest of the conversation complaining about how hard it was to find good help since I had left. Brandon's response was the most telling. He barely acknowledged my success before launching into a story about a deal he was working on that would be the biggest in Hayes' development history. The deal, as he described it, sounded remarkably similar to a project I had researched and proposed 3 years earlier, before I left for Chicago. When I mentioned this, he dismissed it. Lots of people have similar ideas, Amanda. What matters is who executes them. He was right about execution, but wrong about who was doing it. During my 4th year in business, I received a call that changed everything. It was from Margaret Foster, a local business reporter who was working on a story about successful female entrepreneurs in the Midwest. She had heard about Hayes & Associates and wanted to include me in her article. The piece was published in the Chicago Tribune business section and was later picked up by several national publications. The attention was overwhelming and wonderful. I was invited to speak at conferences, appear on podcasts, and serve as a mentor for other women starting their own businesses. For the first time in my life, I was being celebrated for my accomplishments instead of expected to downplay them. The recognition also brought something unexpected. Requests from other women who had grown up in families like mine. Women who had been told they were too ambitious, too demanding, or too difficult when all they had wanted was the same opportunities given freely to their brothers. Women who had been trained to accept scraps and call them blessings. I started a monthly workshop called Reclaiming Your Seat at the Table. The sessions were part business training, part therapy, and entirely focused on helping women understand that they deserved more than the leftovers of other people's lives. The workshops filled up immediately with waiting lists that stretched for months. Rachel Kim, who had finished law school and was working at a prestigious firm in Milwaukee, started attending the workshops when she could. During one session, she made an observation that stayed with me. "You know what's interesting, Amanda? You've built something that's worth more than your family's business. You're helping other people build successful lives, and you're doing it all under the name they never thought was worth investing in. That's not just success. That's poetic justice." She was right, but the poetry was just beginning. By my 5th year in business, Hayes & Associates had grown to 15 employees and annual revenue of over $1 million. We had clients in 12 states and a reputation for helping businesses achieve sustainable growth. I had personally consulted with over 200 companies and had watched most of them not just survive, but thrive. The success felt surreal sometimes. I would catch myself in moments of quiet pride, remembering the girl who had been told to be grateful for hand-me-downs and half portions. That girl had grown into a woman who could afford to buy anything she wanted and chose to invest in other people's dreams instead. But success, I learned, has a way of reaching backward into your past and demanding acknowledgement from people who never thought you were worth their attention. The phone call came on a Wednesday afternoon in March. It was my mother, and her voice had a tone I hadn't heard since childhood. Nervous, almost pleading. She started the conversation with small talk about the weather and her garden, but I could tell she was building up to something important. Finally, she got to the point. "Amanda, honey, we've been following your success in the papers, and we're so proud of what you've accomplished. Your father and I were talking, and we think it would be wonderful if you could come home for a visit. Maybe you could tell us more about your business." The request was simple enough, but something in her tone suggested it wasn't entirely social. When I pressed for more details, the truth came out. Hayes' development was struggling. Brandon's big deal had fallen through after 2 years of development, taking most of their capital with it. They were facing serious financial problems and were looking for solutions. I listened to the whole story without interrupting. The company that had been built on my unpaid labor and sustained by my free expertise was now in trouble, and they were calling the daughter they had never invested in to see if she might be willing to help. The conversation ended with an invitation. They were planning a family dinner to discuss the situation, and they hoped I could attend. For the first time in years, I was being invited to sit at their table as more than someone who cleaned up after the meal. I told my mother I would think about it and hung up the phone. Then I sat in my office for a long time, looking out at the Chicago skyline and thinking about scraps and feasts and the difference between being needed and being valued. That evening, I called Rachel and told her about the conversation. Her response was immediate. "Are you going to help them?" I thought about the question for a long time before answering. "Maybe," I said, "but not the way they think." The idea came to me over the weekend while I was preparing for a presentation about sustainable business growth. What if instead of just helping my family's company, I could create something that helped them understand what they had lost when they decided I wasn't worth their investment? What if I could throw them a feast of their own? The plan started, simply. Instead of going home for a quiet family dinner where I would be expected to solve their problems for free, I would invite them to celebrate something they had never thought to celebrate: my success. Hayes & Associates' 5th anniversary was coming up in 6 months. I had been planning a small celebration with my team and key clients, but suddenly I saw an opportunity for something much bigger, something that would allow me to share my success with the people who had helped me achieve it, while also giving my family a front-row seat to everything they had dismissed as impossible. I started planning the celebration of a lifetime, not just for my business, but for every woman who had ever been told she was asking for too much when all she wanted was enough. The invitation I sent to my family for the Hayes & Associates' 5th anniversary celebration was printed on cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing. It was the kind of invitation that announced importance before you even read the words. I had learned something about presentation in my years away from Cedar Rapids. People notice quality, and they remember how you make them feel when they encounter it. The response from my mother came within 2 days. A phone call filled with excitement and gratitude that I had thought to include them in my celebration. She talked about what she would wear, asked about the venue, and wondered if she should bring a gift. The enthusiasm in her voice was something I hadn't heard directed toward me in years. It was the sound of someone who suddenly realized they might have underestimated something important. My father's response was more measured. He called 3 days later with practical questions about the event. Where was it being held? How many people would be attending? What kind of business was I celebrating exactly? His tone was curious but careful, like someone trying to assess the scale of something they hadn't been paying attention to. Brandon didn't call at all. Linda mentioned during her second call that he was excited to attend and was looking forward to seeing what I had built. The fact that he couldn't express this interest directly told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he was taking my success. Brandon had never been someone who acknowledged achievements that weren't his own, but their responses, while predictable, weren't what occupied my thoughts in the weeks following the invitations. What consumed me was the growing realization that this celebration wasn't just about showcasing my success. It was about forcing a confrontation with a truth that had been 25 years in the making. My family had never believed I was capable of building something significant, and they were about to discover they had been catastrophically wrong. The planning for the event became an exercise in strategic storytelling. Every detail was chosen to communicate something specific about who I had become and what I had accomplished without their support. The venue was the Grand Ballroom at Riverside Country Club, the most prestigious location in Cedar Rapids. My family had never been members, despite my father's success in real estate. The membership fees were substantial, and the waiting list was exclusive. But Hayes & Associates had been invited to host events there twice in the past year, and the club manager had offered me the ballroom at a significant discount because of the positive publicity my previous events had generated. The menu was designed by the same catering company that handled corporate events for the largest businesses in Iowa. Nothing about the evening would suggest modesty or small-scale success. This was going to be a feast in every sense of the word, and everyone in attendance would understand that Amanda Hayes had not just survived her departure from family expectations, but had thrived beyond anything they had imagined possible. As the guest list grew, I began to understand the true scope of what I was creating. The event wasn't just a celebration of my business. It was becoming a showcase of an entire network of successful women who had built their own tables instead of fighting for scraps at someone else's. My client list included the founders of 3 companies that had gone public in the past 2 years. My mentor network included women who served on corporate boards, ran nonprofit organizations, and had been featured in national business publications. Rachel Kim flew in from Milwaukee specifically for the event, and she brought with her 2 partners from her law firm who had heard about my work and wanted to meet me in person. David Porter, my original mentor, was driving down from Minneapolis with his wife, who ran a successful consulting firm of her own. Margaret Foster, the business reporter who had first written about my company, was attending as both a guest and a journalist, planning to cover the event for a feature about the growing influence of women-owned businesses in the Midwest. Each confirmation that arrived in my email inbox felt like adding another layer to a story that was becoming bigger than I had anticipated. This wasn't just Amanda Hayes celebrating her business success. This was a demonstration of what happened when someone who had been consistently underestimated decided to build something that couldn't be ignored. The most important invitations, however, went to the women who had attended my Reclaiming Your Seat at the Table workshops. These were the women who understood what it meant to grow up being told you were asking for too much when all you wanted was enough. They knew the feeling of being useful but never valued, of having your contributions acknowledged with the same enthusiasm reserved for someone taking out the trash. I had stayed in touch with many of them as they built their own businesses, changed careers, or simply learned to advocate for themselves in ways they had never been taught. Maria Santos had left her family's restaurant where she had worked for 15 years without pay to open her own catering business. Jennifer Walsh had divorced her husband and started a financial planning firm that now served over 200 clients. Lisa Chen had gone back to school at 38 and was now a practicing attorney specializing in family law. Each of these women represented a different version of the same story. Someone who had been trained to accept less had decided to demand more, and the results spoke for themselves. Their presence at my celebration wouldn't just be about supporting my success. It would be about demonstrating the ripple effect of what happened when women stopped waiting for permission to pursue their dreams. But as the day of the event approached, I found myself thinking less about the celebration and more about the conversation that had prompted it. My mother's phone call asking for help with Hayes development had revealed something I hadn't fully understood about my family's situation. They weren't just struggling financially. They were struggling with the realization that their assumptions about success and capability had been fundamentally wrong. Brandon's failed deal wasn't just a business setback. It was the collapse of everything my parents had believed about natural leadership and inherited ability. They had spent 25 years investing in his potential while dismissing my proven capabilities, and the results were now impossible to ignore. The son they had groomed to take over the family business had nearly destroyed it, while the daughter they had never taken seriously had built something that was worth more than anything they had ever achieved. I learned the details of Hayes Development's situation through a series of carefully orchestrated conversations with people who had remained in Cedar Rapids after I left. My former high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, mentioned during a chance phone call that she had heard the Hayes family was going through a difficult time. A college friend who worked at the local bank let slip during our occasional text exchanges that Hayes Development had been restructuring their debt. My dentist's receptionist, during my appointment when I was home for a brief visit, casually mentioned that Brandon Hayes seemed to be under a lot of stress lately. The picture that emerged was one of systematic decline disguised as temporary setbacks. Brandon had spent 3 years developing a shopping complex that was supposed to be the largest in the region. The project had consumed most of the company's available capital and required significant loans secured by the business assets my father had spent decades accumulating. When the anchor tenant pulled out 6 months before completion, the entire project became financially unsustainable. But the real problem wasn't just the failed development. It was the pattern of decision-making that had led to the failure. Brandon had pursued the project despite warnings from contractors about cost overruns. He had ignored market research that suggested the location wouldn't support the level of retail traffic the project required. He had made promises to investors that were based more on optimism than analysis. Everything I learned about the situation confirmed what I had suspected for years. Brandon had been handed authority he hadn't earned and responsibility he couldn't handle, while I had been developing the exact skills that could have prevented the disaster they were now facing. The irony was almost too perfect to be accidental. The business knowledge I had gained through necessity, the analytical skills I had developed out of curiosity, and the strategic thinking I had learned through trial and error were precisely what Hayes Development needed to survive their current crisis. But they had made it clear years ago that my input wasn't valued, and I had learned to invest my expertise where it would be appreciated. As I finalized the details for the anniversary celebration, I realized that the event was becoming something I hadn't originally intended. It wasn't just a party or even a business showcase. It was becoming a reckoning. My family would be sitting in a room filled with people who had achieved significant success, and they would be forced to confront the fact that their daughter, the one they had never invested in, was the reason everyone was there. The evening would tell a story, and that story would be about the difference between inherited expectations and earned achievements. Every person in that room would be there because they had proven themselves worthy of invitation through their own accomplishments. My family would be there because I had chosen to invite them, despite having every reason not to. 3 weeks before the event, I received another call from my mother. This time, the conversation was different. She started with the usual pleasantries, but there was an underlying tension in her voice that suggested she was building up to something important. Finally, she got to the point. "Amanda, honey, we've been thinking about your celebration, and we're so excited to be included. But we were wondering if maybe, while you're in town, you might have some time to sit down with your father and Brandon. They've been dealing with some challenges at the business, and they think your perspective might be helpful." The request was delivered with the same casual tone my mother had always used when asking me to help with family obligations. But something about it felt different this time. There was a hesitancy in her voice, almost a deference, that I had never heard before. She was asking for help instead of simply expecting it to be provided. I told her I would consider it, but that my schedule during the visit would be quite busy with event preparations and meetings with clients who were traveling in for the celebration. It was the first time I had ever made my family work around my priorities instead of automatically rearranging my life to accommodate theirs. The conversation ended with my mother expressing how proud she was of everything I had accomplished, and how much they were all looking forward to celebrating with me. The words were right, but there was something in her tone that suggested she was beginning to understand that this celebration was about more than just business success. It was about proving something that should never have needed to be proven. After hanging up, I sat in my office and thought about the phone calls I had been receiving from Cedar Rapids. My family's sudden interest in my business expertise wasn't coincidental. They were facing a crisis that required exactly the kind of strategic thinking they had dismissed when it came from me. But now that I had proven my capabilities in a context they couldn't ignore, they wanted access to everything they had previously rejected. The pattern was familiar, but the power dynamic was completely reversed. For the first time in my life, my family needed something from me more than I needed anything from them. They needed my knowledge, my connections, my proven ability to turn struggling situations into successful outcomes. And they needed it badly enough to swallow whatever pride had prevented them from acknowledging my capabilities for 25 years. But what they didn't understand was that expertise, once dismissed, doesn't automatically become available again just because circumstances change. Trust, once broken, doesn't automatically repair itself just because need becomes desperate. And respect, once withheld, doesn't automatically materialize just because success becomes undeniable. I had spent 5 years building Hayes & Associates without their support, encouragement, or investment. I had developed my skills, grown my network, and established my reputation entirely independent of their recognition or approval. The business I was about to celebrate existed because I had learned to succeed without them, not because I was hoping to eventually succeed with them. The anniversary celebration was going to tell that story, whether they understood it or not. Every detail of the evening would demonstrate that Amanda Hayes had not just survived her family's low expectations, but had used their dismissal as fuel to build something they could never have imagined. But first, I had to decide what role, if any, I wanted them to play in the story I was about to tell. The invitation had been extended and accepted. They would be in the room when I stood at that podium and addressed 300 people who had gathered to celebrate something they had never believed I could achieve. The question wasn't whether they would witness my success. The question was whether they would understand what they had missed by never investing in it in the first place. 2 weeks before the celebration, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called my father and agreed to meet with him and Brandon during my visit to Cedar Rapids. Not because I had forgiven their years of dismissal, and not because I felt obligated to solve their problems, but because I had realized that the conversation would be the perfect final chapter in a story that had been 25 years in the making. They needed to understand exactly what they had lost when they decided I wasn't worth their investment. And I needed them to understand that their current crisis wasn't something that had happened to them. It was something they had created through years of valuing potential over performance, assumptions over analysis, and favoritism over fairness. The meeting was scheduled for the afternoon before the anniversary celebration. By the time we sat down to discuss Hayes Development's future, everyone in that room would already know that Amanda Hayes had built something worth celebrating. The only question would be whether they were ready to acknowledge how much their dismissal had cost them. As I finalized the seating chart for the anniversary dinner, I made one last strategic decision. My family would be seated at a table near the front of the room, close enough to see every detail of the celebration, but far enough from the podium that they couldn't participate unless invited. They would be observers at a feast they had never thought I could prepare, witnesses to a success they had never imagined I could achieve. And when I stood up to address the room, to thank the people who had believed in my vision when my own family hadn't, they would finally understand the difference between being fed scraps and being invited to feast. The stage was set. The story was ready to be told. And for the first time in my life, I would be the one holding the microphone while they sat quietly and listened to everything they had missed by never believing I had anything worth saying. The morning of my anniversary celebration, I woke up in my childhood bedroom for the first time in 3 years. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was preparing for the biggest professional triumph of my life in the same room where I had once cried over math homework while Brandon got tutoring help, where I had sewn patches on my thrift store clothes while he got shopping trips to the mall, where I had planned my escape to Chicago while listening to my parents discuss his limitless potential through the thin walls. Everything about the room remained frozen in time. The same pale yellow walls, the same twin bed with its worn comforter, the same desk where I had written scholarship essays and college applications with a determination born from necessity. But I was not the same person who had left this room 5 years ago with 2 suitcases and a bus ticket to a life my family couldn't envision. I had arrived in Cedar Rapids the evening before, driving my BMW through neighborhoods that seemed smaller than I remembered. The car was a calculated choice, not ostentatious enough to seem like showing off, but nice enough to make a statement about what success looked like when it was earned instead of inherited. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, I noticed my father watching from the living room window. The expression on his face was hard to read, but it wasn't the dismissive glance I was accustomed to. It was assessment. Dinner the night before had been an exercise in carefully managed tension. My mother had prepared my favorite meal from childhood, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, but the portions were equal now. No one got seconds before everyone had firsts. No one's plate was fuller than anyone else's. The change was subtle, but significant, and I wondered if it was conscious or if they had simply forgotten the hierarchy that had once governed every family meal. The conversation had danced around the obvious topics. Brandon asked polite questions about my business, but didn't really listen to the answers. My father made observations about Chicago weather and traffic patterns while clearly wanting to discuss something else entirely. My mother filled silences with updates about neighbors and relatives, her voice carrying an unusual nervousness that suggested she knew this dinner was more important than she was making it seem. But it was the things they didn't say that spoke loudest. No one mentioned Hayes Development's troubles. No one asked directly for my help or advice. No one acknowledged that my presence in their house represented a reversal of fortune that would have been unimaginable when I left for Chicago. They were waiting for something, but they weren't sure how to ask for it. Now, as I prepared for the day that would change everything between us, I had a clarity of purpose that felt almost supernatural. This wasn't about revenge, though I couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing they would soon understand exactly what they had underestimated. This was about closure. About finally having a conversation that should have happened years ago, but from a position of strength instead of desperation. I had scheduled the meeting with my father and Brandon for 2 o'clock, 4 hours before the anniversary celebration began. The timing was strategic. Early enough that we could have a complete conversation without the pressure of event preparation, but late enough that they would spend the morning thinking about what they wanted to say to me. By 2 o'clock, they would be ready to have the kind of honest discussion that had been impossible when they held all the power. I dressed carefully for both occasions. For the meeting, I chose a navy blue business suit that projected competence, without intimidation. For the celebration, I had brought a burgundy dress that I had purchased specifically for this evening. It was elegant, expensive, and unmistakably the choice of someone who no longer worried about budgets or approval. But for now, it hung in the closet while I prepared to have the conversation that would determine what my relationship with my family would look like going forward. The meeting was held in my father's home office, the same room where I had once been lectured about being grateful for opportunities I hadn't actually been given, the same room where Brandon had been praised for ideas he had never developed and potential he had never realized. But the power dynamic in that room was about to shift in a way that none of us had anticipated 5 years ago. My father sat behind his desk, trying to project the authority that had once been unquestionable. Brandon took the chair across from me, his posture casual but his expression serious. They had clearly discussed their approach to this conversation, but I could see uncertainty in their eyes. They needed something from me, but they weren't sure how to ask for it without acknowledging that they had been wrong about my capabilities for my entire life. Thomas cleared his throat and began with the kind of formal tone he had always used for business discussions. "Amanda, we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us during your visit. We know you're busy preparing for tonight's celebration, and we're looking forward to seeing what you've built." The words were right, but there was something stilted about them, as if he was reading from a script he hadn't quite memorized. He continued with a brief overview of Hayes Development's current situation, speaking in the kind of measured language that executives use when they're trying to minimize the appearance of crisis. But I had done my homework, and I knew the reality was more dire than he was admitting. The failed shopping complex had consumed nearly $2 million in development costs and loans. The company's credit lines were maxed out, and they were behind on payments to 3 major suppliers. They had been forced to lay off 6 employees in the past year, and they were currently operating with a skeleton crew that couldn't handle any significant new projects. More importantly, their reputation in the local business community had taken a hit. Brandon's management of the shopping complex project had been marked by cost overruns, missed deadlines, and poor communication with contractors. Word had spread that Hayes Development was struggling with both financial management and project execution, and new clients were choosing competitors who seemed more reliable. When my father finished his carefully sanitized version of their problems, he leaned back in his chair and waited for my response. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before I spoke. "I appreciate you sharing the situation with me," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "But I'm curious why you think my perspective would be helpful. The last time I offered input on business operations, I was told I was being an outsider who didn't understand the bigger picture." The directness of my response clearly caught them off guard. Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and my father's jaw tightened in a way that reminded me of every conversation where my questions had been dismissed as inappropriate. But instead of the defensive reaction I expected, my father surprised me. "You're right," he said quietly. "We made mistakes in how we handled your input when you were working with us. We thought we were protecting you from business pressures, but we see now that we were dismissing valuable insights." The admission was partial and carefully worded, but it was more acknowledgement than I had ever received from him. Brandon remained silent, which spoke volumes about his level of comfort with this conversation. I decided to push deeper. What specifically do you think I could offer that would help your current situation? You have an MBA, Brandon. You've been groomed for business leadership your entire life. Dad, you've been running this company for 15 years. What could I possibly add that you haven't already considered? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see both of them struggling with how to answer it. They knew what they needed from me, but saying it out loud would require acknowledging that their assumptions about capability and preparation had been fundamentally flawed. Finally, Brandon spoke, and his honesty surprised me. The truth is, Amanda, I think I'm in over my head. The shopping complex project seemed like a sure thing when I started it, but every decision I made seemed to create two new problems. I never learned how to handle the kind of complex logistics that you were managing when you worked here. It was the first time I had ever heard Brandon admit to any kind of professional inadequacy, and the moment felt significant enough to acknowledge. I appreciate you saying that, I told him. It takes courage to admit when you're struggling. But I wasn't ready to let him off the hook entirely. The question is why you didn't think you needed to learn those skills before taking on a project of that magnitude. When I was working here, I asked to be included in planning meetings so I could understand how major decisions were made. I was told that was unnecessary because I was handling the detail work. My father interjected, his voice carrying a defensive edge that suggested we were approaching territory he found uncomfortable. We thought we were giving you opportunities to develop your strengths without overwhelming you with responsibilities you weren't ready for. The explanation was familiar, but it sounded different now that they needed my help. I looked at both of them for a moment before responding. Let me ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If Brandon had shown the same level of competence in logistics, financial analysis, and problem-solving that I demonstrated during my 3 years working here, would you have excluded him from strategic planning meetings? The silence that followed was answer enough, but I waited for one of them to say it out loud. No, my father finally admitted. We probably would have increased his involvement in higher-level decisions. So the issue wasn't that I wasn't ready for more responsibility, I continued. The issue was that you never intended to give me more responsibility, regardless of how ready I was. It was a conclusion they couldn't argue with, and the recognition of that fact was written across both of their faces. We were finally having the conversation that should have happened 5 years ago, but the circumstances had changed dramatically. Then, I had been asking for opportunities they didn't want to give me. Now, they were asking for help they couldn't afford to refuse. Brandon cleared his throat and tried to steer the conversation toward solutions. What would you recommend we do to stabilize the business and move forward? The question was reasonable, but I wasn't ready to provide free consulting to people who had spent years dismissing my input. Instead, I asked a question of my own. Before I offer any suggestions, I need to understand what you're actually asking for. Are you looking for my advice as a family member, or are you looking to hire my professional services? The distinction clearly hadn't occurred to them, and I could see them exchanging glances as they tried to figure out how to respond. They had assumed I would help them the same way I had always helped them, out of family obligation and without compensation. But Hayes and Associates didn't work for free, and I had learned the difference between being generous and being exploited. My father answered first. We were hoping you might be willing to offer some guidance as a family member, given our history and your success in building your own business. The answer revealed everything I needed to know about how they viewed this conversation. Even in crisis, even after years of watching me build something they couldn't have imagined, they still expected me to provide my expertise without compensation, because family obligations trumped professional boundaries. I leaned back in my chair and considered my response carefully. Let me explain how this looks from my perspective, I said. For 3 years, I provided financial analysis, logistics coordination, and strategic insights to this company without compensation beyond a small hourly wage. My contributions were dismissed as detail work, and my suggestions for improvement were rejected as inappropriate input from someone who didn't understand the bigger picture. I paused to let that sink in before continuing. Now, after 5 years of building a consulting firm that serves clients across 12 states, after proving that my strategic insights can help struggling businesses achieve sustainable growth, you're asking me to provide the same services I offered years ago, but you're asking for them under the same terms as before. Family obligation instead of professional recognition. Brandon started to interrupt, but I held up my hand to stop him. I'm not finished. The business you're asking me to help save is worth approximately $2.8 million, based on assets and current market conditions. Hayes & Associates generated $1.2 million in revenue last year, and our client success rate is 91%. When companies hire us to solve the kind of problems you're facing, they pay our standard consulting rates because they understand the value of proven expertise. The numbers hung in the air between us, concrete evidence of exactly what they had, dismissed when they decided my capabilities weren't worth investing in. My father's expression had shifted from hopeful to calculating, as if he was trying to figure out whether my success was significant enough to require a change in how he approached our relationship. What are your standard consulting rates? He asked, and I could hear the businessman in him trying to assess whether my services were worth the cost. For a comprehensive business analysis and strategic restructuring plan, which is what Hayes Development needs, the fee would be $25,000, plus implementation support at $300 per hour. The timeline would be approximately 6 weeks for the analysis and recommendations, followed by ongoing support as needed. The figure was fair market value for the kind of work they needed, but I could see both of them struggling with the idea of paying their daughter for services they had once expected her to provide for free. It was a psychological adjustment that went beyond simple business economics. They were being forced to acknowledge that the little girl who had once organized their filing cabinets for spending money had grown into a professional whose expertise commanded real value in the marketplace. That's a significant investment, my father said carefully. We'd need to see a detailed proposal before making that kind of financial commitment. Of course, I replied. I don't expect anyone to hire Hayes & Associates without understanding exactly what they're getting for their investment. But I want to be clear about something. If you decide you'd prefer family advice instead of professional consulting, I'm happy to offer general suggestions over dinner conversation. But I won't provide detailed business analysis or strategic planning without appropriate compensation. I learned a long time ago that advice given for free is usually valued accordingly. Brandon looked confused by the distinction I was making. What's the difference between family advice and professional consulting? The question revealed how little he understood about the work I actually did, despite his earlier admission about being overwhelmed by logistics. I explained patiently. Family advice would be general observations about business management based on my experience. Professional consulting would be a comprehensive analysis of your financial situation, market position, operational efficiency, and strategic options, followed by specific recommendations with implementation timelines and measurable outcomes. The explanation seemed to clarify something for my father. You're saying that if we want you to actually solve our problems, we need to hire you the same way any other client would. Exactly, I confirmed. And if you're not comfortable with that arrangement, I understand. There are other consulting firms that specialize in helping family businesses navigate crisis situations. I'd be happy to provide you with referrals to colleagues who do excellent work in this area. The offer to refer them to competitors was strategic. It demonstrated that I wasn't desperate for their business, while also making it clear that professional help was available if they were willing to pay for it. They could choose to hire me under professional terms, hire someone else under the same terms, or continue trying to solve their problems without expert guidance. But they couldn't continue expecting me to provide valuable services for free simply because we shared DNA. My father and Brandon exchanged another look, and I could see them having a silent conversation about how to proceed. They had come into this meeting expecting to leave with free advice from a family member who felt obligated to help. Instead, they were being offered the opportunity to hire a proven consultant at market rates. The shift in dynamic was exactly what I had hoped to achieve, but it was clearly challenging for them to process. They were being forced to choose between their assumption that family members should sacrifice for each other and their need for professional expertise that could actually solve their problems. "Can we have some time to discuss this and get back to you?" Brandon asked, and I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Of course," I replied. "Take all the time you need. But I should mention that Hayes & Associates is currently booking new clients for projects beginning in October. If you decide you'd like to move forward, we'd need to finalize agreements within the next 2 weeks to meet that timeline." The artificial deadline was another strategic element. I wasn't actually booked solid through September, but I wanted them to understand that my time had value and availability that needed to be respected. They couldn't assume I would drop everything to accommodate their crisis simply because they had finally decided my expertise might be useful. As the meeting concluded, I stood up and shook hands with both of them, maintaining the professional demeanor I would use with any potential client. "Thank you for thinking of Hayes & Associates for your consulting needs," I said. "I look forward to hearing from you about how you'd like to proceed." The formality of my goodbye clearly surprised them, but it established the boundary I needed them to understand. They could have access to my professional expertise, but only under professional terms. The days of expecting free labor from Amanda Hayes were over, regardless of family relationships or childhood obligations. Walking out of that office, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with whether they decided to hire me. For the first time in my life, I had sat in that room as an equal, discussing terms instead of accepting assignments, setting boundaries instead of absorbing expectations. In 4 hours, I would stand in front of 300 people and celebrate the business I had built without their support. But this conversation had been its own kind of victory. I had finally made them understand that the daughter they had never invested in had grown into a professional they couldn't afford to dismiss. Whether they chose to hire Hayes & Associates or find help elsewhere, they would never again assume that Amanda Hayes would provide valuable services simply because family members were supposed to sacrifice for each other. The power balance had shifted permanently, and we all knew it. The Grand Ballroom at Riverside Country Club had been transformed into something that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread about successful corporate events. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in ivory linens, each centerpiece a carefully arranged collection of white roses and gold accents that spoke of elegance without ostentation. The room could hold 350 people comfortably, and tonight it would be filled to capacity with individuals who represented the network I had built over 5 years of proving that success was something you created, not something you inherited. I arrived at the venue 3 hours before the event was scheduled to begin, not because I needed to micromanage the setup, but because I wanted to stand in that space and absorb what it represented. This was my room, filled with my achievements, celebrating my vision. For someone who had grown up being told to be grateful for whatever space was left after everyone else had taken what they wanted, the sensation of claiming an entire ballroom was almost overwhelming. Rachel Kim arrived shortly after I did, having driven up from Milwaukee that afternoon. She took one look at the setup and shook her head in amazement. "Amanda, this is incredible. You've really done something spectacular here." But it was more than just the visual impact of the room that impressed her. As we walked through the space, checking details and reviewing the evening's timeline, she kept commenting on the guest list. The mayor of Cedar Rapids was attending, along with the president of the Chamber of Commerce and the publisher of the local business journal. 3 members of the Iowa State Senate had confirmed their attendance, drawn by the economic development angles of my work with women-owned businesses. The regional director of the Small Business Administration was flying in specifically for the event. This isn't just a business celebration. Rachel observed as we watched the catering staff arranging place settings. "This is a demonstration of influence. You've created something that civic leaders want to be associated with." She was right, though I hadn't consciously planned it that way. The guest list had grown organically as word spread about the anniversary celebration. People wanted to attend not just because they respected what Hayes and Associates had accomplished, but because they wanted to be seen as supporters of the kind of economic growth my business represented. I had become someone whose success reflected, well, on other people's judgment. The transformation felt surreal when I thought about the meeting that afternoon. My father and Brandon had left our conversation with homework to do, trying to figure out whether they could afford to hire the consulting services they needed or whether they would continue trying to solve their problems without professional help. Meanwhile, I was preparing to host an event that would demonstrate exactly why my expertise commanded the fees I had quoted them. As guests began arriving at 6 o'clock, I positioned myself near the entrance to greet people personally. This wasn't just good manners, it was strategic. I wanted everyone who entered that room to understand that Amanda Hayes was the reason they were there, that this celebration existed because of what I had built and whom I had connected with over the past 5 years. The early arrivals were mostly local business leaders and clients from the Cedar Rapids area. Margaret Foster, the business journalist who had first written about my company, arrived with a photographer who would be documenting the evening for a follow-up feature about the growth of women-owned businesses in Iowa. David Porter, my mentor from Chicago, came with his wife Sarah, who ran her own consulting firm and had driven down specifically to meet some of my clients who were looking to expand into markets she served. But it was the arrival of my workshop participants that created the most emotionally charged moments of the evening. Maria Santos, who had left her family's restaurant to start her own catering business, arrived wearing a dress that clearly represented a significant investment for someone building a new company. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for showing me that wanting more wasn't selfish." Jennifer Walsh, the financial planner who had divorced her husband and built a practice serving 200 clients, brought her teenage daughter with her. She introduced the girl as someone who would never have to choose between family expectations and personal dreams, because she was growing up watching women create their own opportunities. Lisa Chen, who had returned to law school at 38 and now specialized in family law, arrived with 2 colleagues from her firm who had heard about my work and wanted to discuss potential collaboration on cases involving women leaving family businesses under difficult circumstances. Each conversation reinforced the same theme. The women in that room had stopped waiting for permission to pursue their goals, and the results spoke for themselves. They were building companies, serving clients, and creating opportunities not just for themselves, but for other women who needed to see that success was possible, even when your family didn't believe in your potential. As the room filled, I found myself watching for my family's arrival with a mixture of anticipation and curiosity. They would be walking into a space that told a story they had never been part of, surrounded by people who had supported my vision, when they hadn't even understood what I was trying to achieve. They arrived exactly at 7 o'clock, the official start time for the event. My mother had chosen a conservative black dress that was appropriate but unremarkable. My father wore a dark suit that looked expensive but dated, as if he had purchased it years ago for special occasions and hadn't updated his formal wardrobe since. Brandon appeared uncomfortable in a navy blazer and tie, the kind of outfit that suggested he didn't attend many events that required professional attire. But it was their expressions that interested me most. They looked around the ballroom with a combination of surprise and assessment, clearly trying to process the scale and sophistication of what they were seeing. This wasn't a small business celebration in a hotel conference room. This was a major networking event in one of the most prestigious venues in the city. I greeted them the same way I had greeted every other guest, with professional warmth and genuine appreciation for their attendance. "Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm so glad you could make it." Linda hugged me a little too tightly, as if she was trying to communicate something she couldn't say out loud. Thomas shook my hand and complimented the venue, his businessman's eye clearly calculating what this kind of event must have cost to organize. Brandon looked around the room and made a comment about how many people had shown up, as if he was surprised that I knew this many individuals worth inviting to a business celebration. I introduced them to several people near the entrance, watching their reactions as they learned more about the network I had built. When I introduced them to Margaret Foster, the business journalist, my mother's eyes widened as she realized someone was covering the event for publication. When I introduced them to David Porter and mentioned his role as my mentor, my father's expression shifted to something I had rarely seen from him: respect for someone else's assessment of my capabilities. But the most telling moment came when I introduced them to Rachel Kim. They had met her years ago when she was my college roommate, back when she was just another student they barely paid attention to. Now she was a partner at a prestigious law firm, and when she mentioned that she had flown in from Milwaukee specifically for my celebration, they began to understand that their daughter had built relationships that extended far beyond the local business community they were familiar with. As cocktail hour progressed, I moved through the room systematically, making sure to spend time with every table and connect people who could benefit from knowing each other. This was one of the skills I had developed through necessity: the ability to see connections and facilitate introductions that created value for everyone involved. Tonight, it was also a demonstration of exactly what my family had missed by dismissing my contributions for so many years. I watched them from across the room as they tried to navigate conversations with people they didn't know, discussing a business they had never really understood. Brandon looked particularly out of place, clearly struggling to make small talk with successful women entrepreneurs who had built companies from scratch. My father was more comfortable in business networking situations, but I could see him trying to figure out how to position himself in conversations where everyone knew he was Amanda Hayes' father, but no one seemed particularly impressed by Hayes' development. My mother found her footing more quickly, gravitating toward conversations about community involvement and charitable work. Several of my clients served on nonprofit boards, and she was able to contribute to discussions about fundraising and volunteer coordination. But even those conversations kept circling back to my work, as people asked how her daughter had developed such effective strategies for helping women build sustainable businesses. At 7:30, I took the microphone for the first time that evening to welcome everyone and thank them for attending. The room quieted immediately, and I could feel the attention of 300 people focused on what I had to say. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Hayes & Associates 5th anniversary celebration. When I started this company 5 years ago, I had a vision of what was possible when women stopped waiting for permission to pursue their dreams and started creating their own opportunities. Tonight, looking around this room, I can see that vision has become reality in ways I never could have imagined. The applause was warm and sustained, and I used the moment to scan the room and make eye contact with as many people as possible. This was my audience, people who had chosen to spend their Friday evening celebrating something I had built. I continued, with a brief overview of what Hayes & Associates had accomplished over the past 5 years, sharing statistics about client success rates, business growth, and the economic impact of the companies we had helped establish or expand. But the real message wasn't in the numbers. It was in the room itself, in the caliber of people who had chosen to attend, in the recognition that my work was creating ripple effects that extended far beyond individual consulting relationships. The formal program included remarks from 3 keynote speakers. David Porter spoke about the importance of mentorship in developing entrepreneurial talent. The mayor talked about the economic development benefits of supporting women-owned businesses. Margaret Foster discussed the changing landscape of business leadership and the role that companies like Hayes & Associates played in that transformation. But it was the third speaker who delivered the message that hit closest to home. Dr. Patricia Williams, a professor of business psychology at the University of Iowa, had been asked to speak about family dynamics in business development. Her research focused on how childhood experiences shaped entrepreneurial motivation, and her remarks touched on themes that felt uncomfortably personal. She talked about how many successful women business owners had grown up in families where their capabilities were underestimated or undervalued. She discussed the psychological impact of being treated as less capable than siblings, and how that experience often became fuel for proving doubters wrong. She mentioned research showing that women who started businesses after leaving family enterprises often outperformed companies that had been passed down through traditional inheritance patterns. As she spoke, I found myself glancing toward my family's table. They were listening intently, but their expressions suggested they were beginning to understand that this wasn't just an academic presentation. This was a description of dynamics they had lived through, viewed from a perspective they had never considered. Dr. Williams concluded her remarks with an observation that felt like it had been written specifically for my situation. Often, the family members who dismiss a woman's business capabilities are the same people who later need her expertise to solve problems they can't handle themselves. The irony is that by the time they recognize her value, she has usually built something more successful than what they were protecting her from. The applause for her presentation was enthusiastic, but I noticed several people in the audience glancing toward my family's table with expressions that suggested they understood the subtext of what had just been said. Dinner was served at 8:15, and I used the opportunity to visit each table personally, thanking people for attending and hearing about what they were working on. This wasn't just courtesy, it was intelligence gathering. Every conversation gave me insights into potential collaboration opportunities, client needs, and market trends that could inform my company's future direction. But it was also a demonstration of something my family had never seen from me: confidence in social situations where I was clearly the person everyone wanted to talk to. Growing up, I had been invisible at family gatherings, the daughter who helped serve food and clean up while Brandon held court with stories about his latest achievements. Tonight, I was the center of attention, and people were seeking me out because they valued what I had to say. When I reached my family's table, the conversation stopped in a way that suggested they had been discussing something they didn't want me to overhear. I sat down for a few minutes, asking how they were enjoying the evening and whether they had met anyone interesting. Linda was effusive in her praise for the event and the venue, telling me how proud she was of everything I had accomplished. Thomas was more measured, but clearly impressed by the level of civic engagement represented in the room. Brandon seemed quieter than usual, as if he was processing something he hadn't expected to encounter. But it was my father's next comment that revealed what they had been discussing before I arrived at their table. "Amanda, we've been talking about your consulting proposal from this afternoon. We'd like to move forward with hiring Hayes & Associates to help us develop a strategic plan for the business." The announcement was delivered in a tone that suggested they had made a significant decision, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. They had spent the evening watching me interact with business leaders, civic officials, and successful entrepreneurs. They had listened to speakers discuss my company's impact on economic development and business growth. They had seen concrete evidence that Amanda Hayes was someone whose expertise was valued and sought after by people whose opinions they respected. Most importantly, they had realized that if they didn't hire me, they would need to hire someone else with similar credentials and experience. And after spending an evening in a room full of people who clearly viewed me as a peer and colleague, they were beginning to understand that my consulting fees weren't arbitrary numbers. They were market rates for proven expertise. "I'm glad to hear that," I replied, maintaining the same professional tone I would use with any client who had decided to move forward with a project. "I'll have Rachel send you a formal proposal and contract early next week, and we can schedule a kickoff meeting once the paperwork is finalized." The response was businesslike and appropriate, but I could see it surprised them. They had expected more enthusiasm, perhaps gratitude that they had decided to give me this opportunity. Instead, they were getting the same professional courtesy I extended to every client who hired Hayes & Associates. But that was exactly the boundary I needed them to understand. They could hire my company's services, and they would receive excellent value for their investment. But they couldn't hire my services and expect special treatment because we shared a last name. Professional relationships required professional behavior from everyone involved. As I prepared to return to my hosting duties, Brandon asked a question that revealed something important about how the evening had affected him. Amanda, when you were working at Hayes Development, did you always know you could build something like this? The question was more personal than anything he had asked me in years, and I could hear genuine curiosity in his voice. I thought about it for a moment before answering honestly. I knew I was capable of more than what I was being asked to do, but I had no idea what was possible until I started trying to achieve it. The answer seemed to satisfy something he needed to understand, and I left their table feeling like we had finally begun to have the kind of honest conversation that should have happened years ago. The evening continued with networking, dancing, and informal presentations from several clients who wanted to share how Hayes and Associates had helped them achieve their business goals. Each testimonial reinforced the same message. Amanda Hayes had built something that created real value for people who were serious about success. As the celebration wound down around 10:30, I found myself standing near the entrance again, thanking people for attending as they prepared to leave. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with several people asking about future events and others wanting to schedule follow-up meetings to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. But it was the conversation with my family as they prepared to leave that provided the perfect ending to an evening that had been years in the making. Linda hugged me tightly and told me how proud she was, but there was something different in her voice. This wasn't the conditional pride I was accustomed to, based on meeting expectations they had set for me. This was recognition of something I had accomplished entirely on my own terms. Thomas shook my hand and thanked me for including them in what he called a remarkable evening. But then he added something I had never heard from him before. Amanda, I want you to know that we understand now what we missed when you were younger. We made assumptions about what you needed and what you were capable of, and we were wrong. The apology was partial and carefully worded, but it was more acknowledgement than I had ever received from him. More importantly, it was recognition that their treatment of me had been based on flawed judgment rather than accurate assessment of my capabilities. Brandon's goodbye was the most significant. He looked around the ballroom one more time, taking in the evidence of everything I had built, and said quietly, I never understood what you were trying to tell us back then. I get it now. It wasn't a complete apology or a full acknowledgement of the years they had wasted dismissing my potential, but it was recognition that their assumptions had been wrong and that my success wasn't accidental or temporary. As I watched them walk out of the ballroom and into the Cedar Rapids night, I realized that the conversation we had been avoiding for 25 years was finally over. They understood what they had missed, and I understood that I no longer needed them to acknowledge it. The girl who had grown up eating scraps while they feasted had grown into a woman who could host her own banquet. And everyone in that room, including her family, knew exactly what that transformation meant. 6 months after the anniversary celebration, I stood in the conference room of my expanded offices in downtown Cedar Rapids, reviewing the final report for the Hayes Development Consulting Project. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me that Hayes and Associates had grown large enough to require a satellite office in my hometown, and that my family's business had become our most successful case study for turning around a failing enterprise. The transformation had been more dramatic than even I had anticipated. Working with Hayes Development hadn't just been about fixing their immediate financial crisis. It had required rebuilding their entire approach to business operations, from project management systems to client relations strategies. More importantly, it had required Thomas and Brandon to acknowledge that everything they thought they knew about running a successful company had been based on outdated assumptions and inherited habits rather than proven methodologies. The process had begun 3 weeks after the anniversary celebration, when Rachel sent them the formal consulting contract. The terms were exactly what I had outlined during our meeting, with one addition that surprised them. Hayes and Associates required that all strategic recommendations be implemented within agreed-upon timelines, with progress reports submitted monthly. We didn't provide advice that clients could choose to ignore when it became inconvenient. Brandon had been the most resistant to this requirement initially. He was accustomed to making decisions based on instinct and personal preference, without having to justify his choices to outside oversight. But the alternative was continuing to operate a business that was hemorrhaging money and credibility, so he agreed to follow the implementation schedule we developed. The first month of the I project had been brutal for both of them. Hayes and Associates' initial analysis revealed problems that went far deeper than the failed shopping complex. Their accounting systems were inconsistent, their vendor relationships were strained by late payments and poor communication, and their project management approach relied on informal arrangements that created confusion and cost overruns. More damaging was what we discovered about their reputation in the local business community. The shopping complex debacle hadn't just cost them money, it had damaged their credibility with contractors, suppliers, and potential clients who had watched the project spiral out of control. People were choosing competitors not because Hayes' development was more expensive, but because they seemed unreliable. Thomas had been shocked by the feedback we gathered during stakeholder interviews. He had assumed that his 15 years of operating the business had established solid relationships and a good reputation. Instead, we found that people respected his work ethic, but questioned his company's ability to deliver projects on time and within budget. Brandon's reaction to the stakeholder feedback had been even more difficult to watch. Several contractors mentioned that working with him required extra effort because he changed his mind frequently, didn't understand construction timelines, and made promises he couldn't keep. One major supplier said they had stopped bidding on Hayes development projects because Brandon's management style created too much uncertainty and risk. But the most telling feedback came from a conversation with the bank that held their commercial loans. The loan officer explained that Hayes development was considered a higher-risk client because their financial projections had proven unreliable and their debt-to-income ratios had deteriorated significantly over the past 3 years. They weren't in immediate danger of default, but they also weren't candidates for the kind of expansion financing that would allow them to pursue larger projects. Presenting this information to Thomas and Brandon had required careful management. They needed to understand the full scope of their problems without becoming so overwhelmed that they gave up on the recovery process. I had learned through working with other family businesses that ego often prevents people from accepting hard truths about their performance, especially when those truths come from family members they had previously dismissed. The solution was to frame everything in terms of market dynamics and industry standards, rather than personal failures. Instead of telling Brandon that his project management skills were inadequate, we showed him data about successful project completion rates and explained the systems that high-performing companies used to achieve those results. Instead of criticizing Thomas for outdated business practices, we presented research about emerging trends in commercial real estate development and demonstrated how competitors were adapting to changing market conditions. This approach allowed them to save face while acknowledging that significant changes were necessary. More importantly, it positioned Hayes and Associates as partners in their recovery rather than critics of their previous performance. The implementation phase had tested everyone's commitment to the process. We required Hayes Development to adopt new project management software that tracked every aspect of job performance, from initial client contact through final completion. We restructured their vendor relationships to include performance metrics and regular communication protocols. We established financial reporting systems that provided real-time information about project profitability and cash flow. Most challenging for Brandon was the requirement that all major project decisions be reviewed by a committee that included Thomas, the lead project manager, and a rotating client representative. This eliminated his ability to make impulsive changes. That disrupted timelines and budgets, but it also meant he had to defend his ideas before implementing them. Thomas had struggled with different aspects of the changes. The new financial reporting systems revealed that several projects he had considered successful had actually been marginally profitable because of cost overruns and timeline extensions. The vendor relationship restructuring forced him to acknowledge that some suppliers had been overcharging them for years because they knew Hayes Development wouldn't challenge invoices or negotiate terms aggressively. But the most significant challenge for both of them was learning to communicate with clients in ways that built confidence rather than creating anxiety. Their previous approach had been to minimize problems and promise solutions without explaining the complexity involved in achieving them. The new approach required them to be transparent about challenges while demonstrating competence in addressing them. The results had been remarkable. Within 4 months, Hayes Development completed their first project under the new management systems 2 weeks ahead of schedule and 8% under budget. The client was so impressed that they hired the company for a larger project and provided referrals to 3 other potential clients. More importantly, the changes had begun to rebuild their reputation in the local business community. Contractors started bidding more aggressively on Hayes Development projects because they knew the work would be managed professionally. Suppliers offered better terms because they trusted that invoices would be paid promptly and communication would be clear. The financial turnaround had been equally dramatic. By month 6 of the consulting engagement, Hayes Development had paid off 2 major outstanding loans and had established a cash reserve that allowed them to pursue opportunities they couldn't have considered a year earlier. But the most significant change hadn't been operational or financial. It had been psychological. Thomas and Brandon had learned to see business challenges as problems to be solved systematically rather than crises to be survived through determination and optimism. They had discovered that professional competence wasn't about having all the answers, but about knowing how to find solutions and implement them effectively. The project had also changed my relationship with them in ways I hadn't anticipated. Working together as consultant and client had required them to treat my input with the respect they would show any professional advisor they were paying for expertise. They couldn't dismiss my recommendations as family interference or question my suggestions based on assumptions about my capabilities. More importantly, the success of the engagement had provided concrete evidence that my business expertise was valuable enough to save their company from potential failure. They had seen firsthand how the systems and strategies I recommended could transform their operations and improve their outcomes. The professional boundaries I had established had also been liberating for me. Instead of feeling responsible for their success or failure as family members, I could focus on providing the best possible service as their consultant. Their results were a reflection of how well they implemented the recommendations, not a measure of my worth as a daughter or sister. This dynamic had extended beyond business interactions. Family dinners had become more comfortable because we were relating to each other as adults with different areas of expertise rather than as parents and child with predetermined roles. Thomas asked my opinion about business decisions because he had learned that my advice was valuable, not because he felt obligated to include me in conversations. Brandon had changed the most dramatically. Working under the new project management systems had taught him skills he had never been required to develop when his authority went unquestioned. He had learned to research decisions thoroughly, communicate plans clearly, and accept feedback without becoming defensive. More importantly, he had begun to understand the difference between being given responsibility and earning it. The committee review process for major decisions meant that his ideas had to be well-researched and clearly articulated before they could be implemented. The experience had been frustrating initially, but it had also shown him that better planning led to better outcomes. 6 months after the consulting engagement began, Hayes Development was operating more successfully than it had at any point in its 15-year history. They had a waiting list of potential clients, strong relationships with vendors and contractors, and financial reserves that allowed them to pursue growth opportunities strategically rather than desperately. The success had also created opportunities for Hayes and Associates. Word spread quickly in the Cedar Rapids business community that Amanda Hayes had turned around her family's struggling company using the same strategies she applied to other consulting clients. 3 other family businesses requested similar services, and 2 companies from neighboring states contacted us about potential engagements. More significantly, the project had established Hayes and Associates as a firm that could handle complex, family business dynamics while maintaining professional standards. This reputation led to referrals from lawyers, accountants, and other professionals who worked with families facing similar challenges. The growth had required me to hire 2 additional consultants and lease larger office space in both Cedar Rapids and Chicago. Hayes and Associates was no longer just Amanda Hayes working with individual clients. It had become a firm with multiple service lines and a reputation that extended throughout the Midwest. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the Hayes development project had been watching my family discover what I had always known about their potential. Thomas had always been hardworking and dedicated, but he had never learned to work strategically. Once he understood how to analyze market conditions and plan projects systematically, his natural business instincts became much more effective. Brandon had always been creative and enthusiastic, but he had never been required to develop discipline or accountability. Once he learned to channel his energy through structured planning and systematic execution, he became a genuinely effective project manager. The transformation hadn't been easy for any of us, but it had proven that capability was something that could be developed rather than something you either possessed or lacked. My family had spent years assuming that business success was about natural talent and inherited authority, when it was actually about learning specific skills and applying them consistently. As I reviewed the final report for the Hayes Development Project, I realized that the consulting engagement had accomplished something more important than saving their business. It had taught all of us that professional relationships based on mutual respect and clearly defined expectations were more productive than family relationships based on inherited roles and unspoken obligations. Thomas called me the day I submitted the final report to thank me for what Hayes and Associates had accomplished and to discuss ongoing support as they continued implementing the systems we had developed. But the conversation that mattered most came from Brandon, who asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss something that wasn't related to the consulting project. We met at a downtown cafe that hadn't existed when I was growing up in Cedar Rapids. The conversation started with his appreciation for how the project had changed his understanding of business management, but it evolved into something more personal. "Amanda, I need to apologize for something that I should have said years ago," he began. "When we were kids, I knew that Mom and Dad treated you differently than they treated me. I knew you were doing more work and getting less recognition. I knew it wasn't fair, but I didn't say anything because it was easier for me when you were handling all the stuff I didn't want to deal with." The acknowledgement was more direct than I had expected, and I could see that it was difficult for him to admit. He continued with an observation that surprised me. "I think I always knew you were smarter and more capable than me, but I was scared that if I admitted it, I would lose the advantages I had. So I just went along with the idea that I was the one who was supposed to inherit everything and run everything, even though I wasn't qualified to do it." His honesty deserved an equally honest response. "I appreciate you saying that, Brandon. But you need to understand that I'm not angry about what happened when we were kids. I'm grateful for it, because it taught me that I could only depend on myself. And that lesson made me stronger than I would have been if everything had been handed to me." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering topics we had never discussed as siblings. He talked about the pressure he had felt to live up to expectations he knew he couldn't meet, and how that pressure had made him defensive and unwilling to admit when he needed help. I talked about the frustration of being constantly underestimated, and how that experience had motivated me to prove that their assumptions were wrong. But the most important part of the conversation was about the future. Brandon asked if I thought there might be opportunities for Hayes Development and Hayes and Associates to collaborate on projects that required both real estate development and business consulting expertise. The idea had potential, and it represented a completely different kind of relationship than anything we had ever had as siblings. The suggestion led to a broader discussion about what our family relationships could look like now that we were all adults with proven capabilities in our respective areas. We didn't need to pretend that our childhood had been fair or that our parents had handled everything perfectly. But we also didn't need to let those experiences define our interactions for the rest of our lives. As I drove back to my office, after the conversation with Brandon, I realized that the story that had begun with a family that made me eat scraps while they feasted had evolved into something I had never expected. We had all learned that there was room at the table for everyone, but only if we were willing to contribute something valuable, rather than simply claiming seats based on birthright or family obligation. The Hayes and Associates anniversary celebration had been about demonstrating what I had accomplished without their support. The consulting engagement had been about proving that my expertise could solve problems they couldn't handle themselves. But this conversation with Brandon had been about discovering that we could build something together that was more successful than what any of us could achieve alone. 6 months later, Hayes Development and Hayes and Associates announced a strategic partnership that would offer comprehensive real estate development and business consulting services to clients throughout the Midwest. The partnership combined Thomas's experience in commercial development, Brandon's project management skills, and my expertise in business strategy and operations. The announcement generated significant interest from potential clients who had been looking for integrated services that could handle both the development and business planning aspects of commercial projects. Within 3 months, the partnership had signed contracts for 4 major projects that neither company could have pursued independently. More importantly, the partnership had created a model for how family members with different strengths could work together as equals rather than falling back into inherited hierarchies based on birth order or childhood assumptions. The little girl who had once sat at the children's table while adults discussed important matters was now leading strategy meetings for projects worth millions of dollars. The family that had once divided opportunities based on gender and favoritism was now allocating responsibilities based on proven competence and professional expertise. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't happened without conflict and difficult conversations. But it had proven that families, like businesses, could change their operating procedures when the old methods stopped producing acceptable results. As I stood in the conference room of our expanded offices, looking out at a downtown Cedar Rapids that was increasingly influenced by projects we had helped plan and implement, I realized that the story was still being written. The girl who had grown up eating scraps had learned to prepare feasts, and she had finally found a family worthy of sharing them with. The humble pie had been served, consumed, and digested. What remained was the work of building something sustainable and successful together, based on respect earned through performance rather than assumed through genetics. And that work, it turned out, was the most satisfying course of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.